In this video, what I'm going to try and do is explain one of the more difficult terms for historical work, but one that is incredibly important for you to get a good understanding of, and that is analysis. So what we're going to look at now is a piece of work, and we're going to look at it in two different ways. The first one is the work that's been put in place has been done by someone who's clearly got good knowledge, have worked very hard at getting as much of that detail into their answer. And to all intents and purposes, this is not a terrible answer. However, what it lacks is analysis. And at A level, you need to have that analysis to make progress and to get up the mark scheme. So what you see here, we're talking about the preliminary bombardment before the Battle of the Somme and its importance. And this individual has clearly done some good work. What they have done is they've used key terms such as the term hurricane bombardment. There is a little bit of depth in terms of the information that predates what we're talking about anyway, in terms of the fact that they'd increased the artillery bombardment in the late part of 1915. There's also some discussion there about the purposes of the bombardment, that it was to cut barbed wire, that they were trying to neutralise the German artillery. There's loads of great stuff there in terms of specific detail, in terms of how many shells, and a comparison with shells in the past, how far away you could hear the bombardment. There's also some demonstration that this was not new to the Western Front. This is not a bad piece of work, but what it lacks is analysis. And what I'd like to do now is to show you virtually the same bit of work, but with analysis included, to demonstrate the difference between being good at knowing your history and being good at historical analysis. So, here we have the two side by side. On the right hand side here is the one we just looked at, but on the left hand side is the answer that I would consider to be a far more analytical answer. So, what I'm hoping you'll notice straight away is that there's a little bit more to it, but actually what I've done is taken some of the second answer out and replaced it with more analytical parts. So, for example, we start off saying the British substantially increased the amount of artillery on the Western Front in late 1915. Then I've added, this was in preparation for Douglas Haig's plan. So now I'm starting to go, okay, so this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about why this was important in the overall context. I'm not going to just talk about what it was, but I'm going to talk about its significance. And here we go. Haig had seen the benefit in his earlier campaigns in Belgium and the obvious problems on that the Somme battlefield afforded tactically. It was unthinkable that a bombardment on the scale he had planned could not overcome these drawbacks. What I'm clearly saying here is that the reason why they chose this method was because there were obvious problems on the Somme, and the bombardment was seen as the key way and the only way to ensure that despite all these problems that the Somme had, this was going to be overcome. Okay, so straight away there is that analytical sense of, I'm explaining exactly why not only was it significant, but why it was chosen in the way that it was. I've also added in there very specifically why they did it, which is in the other one, but I've been very clear and put it into one sentence. The aim was to cut barbed wire and neutralise the German artillery with counter-battery fire. Then I've gone back to the old one, because there was nothing wrong with some of this detail. It is quite useful. It is quite important to emphasise the scale. The British artillery fired more than 1.5 million shells. More than the first year of the war. Another 250,000 shells were fired on the 1st of July. The bombardment could be heard on Hampstead Heath, 300 miles away. Ultimately, the aims of the bombardment were not met, and one might argue were simply unachievable anyway, which in itself makes the tactic of hurricane bombardment, which was the central plank of Haig's plan, not only bad but ultimately negligent. Now what you see is I've then cut in with some more analysis. Here we go. Ultimately, the aims of the bombardment were not met. Be very clear. And one might argue, starting this analysis quite clearly, were simply unachievable anyway, which in itself makes the tactic of hurricane bombardment bad. Not only bad, but ultimately negligent. So what I've said here is, have a look at this. Yeah, I understand that the aims weren't met. And I've said that that would therefore mean that whoever came up with that was negligent in doing so, if that was a possibility. And I've also, just to emphasise that, as you can see here, which was the central plank of Haig's plan. So I've gone back to this idea of, was it significant? Well, it says that Haig wasn't necessarily planning effectively. And so this statement is saying we've looked at why they did it, we've looked at the scale of it, and now we're explaining why the fact that it didn't work is important. But we're not going to just leave it there. And this is a good linking way of putting some analysis in. However, this may not be entirely the case. And then I've gone back to the former answer. You know, again, there was nothing wrong with a lot of the content. As on the Somme, while British shell production had increased since the shell scandal of 1915, quality was poor and many shells failed to explode. Shrapnel was virtually useless against entrenched positions and required accurate fuse settings to cut wire, but very little high explosive ammunition had been manufactured for field artillery. But let's return to this notion of analysis. It may be that Haig's plan was not the problem, but the tools with which he was forced to operate. He could never have achieved the strikes to lessen the impact of the German defenders on British casualty numbers. So ultimately what I'm saying here is, maybe it's not the case that this was a bad plan, it was actually a case that the tools to do the plan weren't effective. But then you could also argue that, you know, the fact that that was the case was his fault as well. But ultimately what you see here is, on the right hand side is an answer that is largely content driven. On the left hand side you have an answer that has a lot of content, but that content is constantly criticised and discussed within the context of why was the bombardment significant. On the right, what was the bombardment about? On the left, what was the bombardment about and why was it significant? That is the difference between an analytical answer and a historical answer. You want to be like the one on the left, not like the one on the right.